We are now in Kant lecture part 8. Here we're going to discuss the concepts of value and worth, absolute value and absolute worth versus relative worth, the notion of an end in itself. We'll discuss the distinction between a person and a thing, reason and desire. The seventh insight that Kant offers to us, and he claims that we have, is that the kind of value that is appropriate to the goodwill, as good in itself, and in light of everything else that we have discussed, is absolute worth or absolute value. One part of that insight is that nothing that is constituted or accessed by desire can have absolute worth, but relative worth only. One day, according to the cause and effect of physical nature, we happen to like something, but the next day we do not. One day we like it more, the next day we like it less. This person happens to like this, that person happens to like that. There can only be changing and relative values with regard to desire. Nothing to do with goodwill can be found here, since the goodwill is good in itself, and independently of whether anyone to happens to like its effects or not, as is captured in the rational idea of duty that accompanies the rational idea of the goodwill. Just like duty, the goodwill is to be done whether one likes it or not, whether it has that kind of high relative worth to us or not. The second part of that insight, that the goodwill is of absolute worth, is that only a rational being, it is, insofar as it is rational, can be an end in itself. As an end in itself, and not a means to an end, rational being has absolute value and worth, and demands respect. This absolute worth and respect is the motivational source of duty for choosing the universal law. And this being an end in itself is what makes a rational being into a person, contrasted to a thing. A thing, rightly, may be made into a means to an end and used arbitrarily in any way. A person, however, may not be made into a thing for use, and may not be arbitrarily used in that way, but may only be made into a thing for use, so to speak, by that person's own will in an act of choosing for oneself or consenting to an action proposed by another. But in what sense, more precisely, is rational being an end in itself? The clue is that we are not simply beings of desire, for which everything has a relative worth as a means to pleasure, and has the worth proportionate to how much pleasure it produces. Desire, by its nature, turns everything into a means to an end of pleasure, and does not recognize or conceptualize any end in itself. Desire does not really recognize or conceptualize at all. Desire simply makes whatever it turns onto into a means for production of pleasure. And the more pleasure something produces, the more valuable it is. The less pleasure something produces, the less valuable it is. And we take it that human beings have the kind of worth that doesn't just depend on whether we happen to like them or not. Reason, unlike desire, conceptualizes and distinguishes between a means and an end. It can conceptualize an end in itself of absolute worth. Goodwill that is not guided by desire's chase of relative worth would be an example of something of absolute worth. So, reason can conceptualize an end in itself of absolute worth and understands it. and understands that it must be treated as an end and not merely as a means. And then reason is faced with a choice. Will it choose to treat persons or rational beings capable of choosing the goodwill as persons? Or will it treat them as things for satisfactions of desires? Will it treat them as ends or as means? Having to make this choice, which is free will, endows rational beings with responsibility and dignity, unlike other beings, and absolute dignity, responsibility, worth, and respect. In that sense, just discussed, rational being is an end in itself and is of absolute worth. The goodwill turns out to be, in addition to choosing the duty to act according to universal laws of rational nature, also a duty to treat rational beings as ends in themselves and not as means only. Let us next illustrate the latter point using the already used examples of duty, suicide, faulty promises, developing one's talents, and assisting others.